No one noticed when he stopped speaking. Not the doctors who reviewed his chart every morning, not the visitors who passed his door without slowing down, and not the hospital staff who had quietly labeled him as just another unresponsive elderly patient. Room 317 was clean, silent, and empty in a way that felt unnatural. There were no family photos on the wall, no cards taped near the bed, no flowers brought by loved ones hoping for recovery. There was only an old man lying still, his eyes open, fixed on the ceiling as if he were watching scenes from another world, scenes no one else could see. The man's name, according to the hospital records, was Ethan Caldwell. He was 87 years old, underweight, physically weak, and officially diagnosed with advanced dementia. To most people, that diagnosis explained everything. It explained why he did not speak, why he rarely moved, and why no one expected anything more from him. Patients like Ethan were often treated with efficiency rather than curiosity. The assumption was simple and cruel at the same time. Whatever made them who they once were was already gone. That night, Nurse Laura almost skipped his room. She had worked 2 consecutive shifts, her body exhausted and her mind operating on routine alone. She had seen hundreds of patients like Ethan before, and experience had taught her that there was usually nothing to discover in rooms like his. Still, as she checked his vital signs, something subtle happened. His hand moved, just slightly. Not in a random or involuntary way, but with intention. It was the kind of movement you only notice if you are truly paying attention. Laura paused. She leaned closer and spoke softly, unsure whether he could still hear her. She asked him if he knew she was there. There was no verbal response, but his breathing changed. It became slower, deeper, more controlled. That was when Laura noticed something beneath the thin hospital blanket, something that did not belong there. She gently lifted the fabric and saw a worn leather strap hanging around his neck. Attached to it was a small rectangular piece of metal, scratched and faded by time. It was a military identification tag. The sight of it stopped her cold. It was not unusual for elderly patients to be veterans, but there was something about the way Ethan held the tag that felt different. His fingers were tightly wrapped around it, as if letting go would mean losing the last piece of himself. When Laura turned the tag over, she could still read the engraving: his name, a service number, his blood type, and the branch of service, United States Army. In that moment, a question formed in her mind and refused to leave. If this man had served his country, why was he here alone? Why had no one come for him? Why did his file list no family members, no emergency contacts, no personal history beyond medical codes and diagnoses? She reviewed his chart again and confirmed what she already feared. There had been no visitors in over 6 months, no belongings other than the clothes he arrived in and the dog tag he refused to release. An entire life reduced to a metal plate and a hospital wristband. At the nurses' station, someone casually referred to him as another forgotten old man. It was not said with malice, only exhaustion. Still, the word forgotten echoed in Laura's mind. She had a growing sense that this man had not been forgotten by chance. It felt deliberate, as if his story had been buried along with everything he had seen and done. That night, Laura made a decision she could not explain logically. She pulled a chair beside Ethan's bed and sat down, even though there was no requirement to do so. She introduced herself and told him she was there with him. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, barely audible, a sound escaped his lips. It was not a word, but a breath, unsteady and heavy with emotion. His grip on the dog tag tightened, and tears slowly filled his eyes. He whispered something so softly that Laura almost missed it. He said, "Don't leave them." Her heart began to race. She asked who he was talking about, but he did not answer. Instead, his breathing grew more uneven, as if the question had pulled him back into something painful and unfinished. In that instant, Laura understood something that would change the way she saw him forever. Ethan Caldwell was not lost to dementia. He was trapped inside a memory that had never released him. Outside room 317, the hospital continued as normal. Phones rang, machines beeped, conversations carried on without pause. Inside that room, however, a war that ended decades ago was still alive. Laura did not yet know what that small piece of metal around his neck truly represented, but she felt certain of one thing. Whatever Ethan had lived through was far more important than anyone realized, and very soon the truth would demand to be seen. If you're still watching, stay with this story. What Laura uncovers next will reveal why this man was erased from memory, and why the past never truly lets its soldiers go. Laura could not forget what she had heard that night. "Don't leave them." The words echoed in her mind long after her shift ended, following her through the hospital corridors and into the quiet of the early morning. Patients with dementia often spoke in fragments, but this had been different. There was intention in his voice, pain behind the whisper, as if he were speaking to people who were still alive somewhere inside him. The next evening, when Laura returned for her shift, she went straight to room 317, driven by a feeling she could no longer ignore. Ethan Caldwell was awake again, his eyes open, fixed on the same invisible point above him. His grip on the dog tag had not loosened. Laura sat beside him and began to speak, not asking questions this time, but telling him simple things. She told him her name again, told him what day it was, told him he was safe. At first, there was no reaction. Then, slowly, his jaw tightened and his breathing grew heavier, as if her voice had unlocked something buried deep inside him. Without warning, his lips began to move. The words came slowly, broken by long pauses, but they were clearer than before. He spoke about heat, about noise, about the smell of smoke and metal. Laura listened in silence as fragments of another life surfaced. He said there were too many bodies to count. He said the ground shook constantly. He said the sky never truly went dark, only red and orange. These were not random images, they were memories. Later that night, Laura searched his name through the hospital's limited database. There was almost nothing. No family records, no previous facilities listed, just one additional detail buried in an old intake form from decades earlier. Ethan Caldwell had been admitted to a VA hospital once, many years ago, after what was described as a combat-related psychological episode. No further explanation was provided. That was when Laura understood. Ethan had not simply grown old and forgotten his past had never released him. Ethan had been drafted at 19 years old, sent overseas before he was old enough to fully understand what war demanded from a man. He had grown up in a quiet town, the kind where everyone knew each other, where life followed predictable patterns. War shattered that simplicity in a matter of weeks. He learned quickly how to survive, but survival came at a cost that no training prepared him for. During one operation, his unit was ordered to hold a position that should never have been held. The intelligence was wrong. The support never arrived. By the time extraction was possible, most of the men he went in with were gone. Ethan survived, but survival felt less like victory and more like punishment. He carried the faces of those men with him, memorized their voices, replayed their final moments in his mind over and over again. He never spoke about it after returning home. When Ethan came back to the United States, there were no parades waiting for him, no counseling offered that truly addressed what he had seen. He tried to live a normal life, tried to work,
tried to build relationships, but the war followed him everywhere. Loud noises sent his heart racing. Silence felt dangerous. Sleep became impossible without nightmares. Slowly, people drifted away. Friends did not know how to talk to him. Employers did not know how to handle him. Eventually, even family learned to keep their distance. Years passed, and Ethan learned how to exist without being noticed. He moved from job to job, apartment to apartment, never staying long enough to feel rooted. He avoided hospitals, avoided questions, avoided anything that might force him to explain who he really was. The only thing he never removed was the dog tag around his neck. It was proof that what he remembered was real, proof that the men he had lost had existed. As his body weakened with age, his mind began to slip further into the past. The present became confusing and unreliable, while the war remained vivid and sharp. Eventually, there was no one left to care for him, no one left who remembered the young man he had once been. When he was finally brought to the hospital, he arrived as a stranger, carrying nothing but memories no one wanted to hear. Back in room 317, Laura felt a growing sense of responsibility. She realized that Ethan's silence had not been emptiness, but endurance. He had been carrying a burden for decades, without relief, without recognition, without forgiveness. And now, as his life neared his end, that burden was surfacing one last time. What Laura did not yet know was that Ethan's military record held secrets far greater than trauma alone. His unit's mission had been buried, and the reason he had been forgotten was not just neglect, it was intentional. If you think this story is about memory loss, think again. What Laura uncovers next will reveal why Ethan Caldwell was erased from history, and why acknowledging the truth could expose a mistake the military never wanted revisited.
Laura's curiosity had turned into something heavier, something closer to responsibility. She could no longer see Ethan Caldwell as just another patient. The fragments of memory he had shared, combined with the emptiness of his records, pointed to a story that had been deliberately erased. During her break, Laura accessed the VA archive system, a database rarely touched unless absolutely necessary. What she found there was not absence, but resistance. Ethan's service record existed, but entire sections were missing, redacted or sealed. Dates were present without descriptions. Units were listed without missions. It was as if someone had carefully removed the heart of his history and left only a skeleton behind. That night, Laura returned to room 317 with a quiet determination. She spoke to Ethan again, calmly and patiently, allowing long pauses between sentences. This time, when she mentioned the war, his reaction was immediate. His fingers clenched the dog tag, his chest rose sharply, and his eyes filled with a fear that had nothing to do with age or illness. He began to speak again, more clearly than before, as if the effort of remembering had broken through something that had held him silent for years. He said they were sent where they were never supposed to be. He said the mission did not exist on paper. No insignia, no official objectives, no recognition. They were told they would be extracted within hours. Days passed instead. Communication was cut. When enemy forces surrounded them, support never came. Ethan described how they held their position far longer than ordered, refusing to abandon wounded men even when retreat was the only rational option. When extraction finally arrived, it was too late for most of them. Laura listened as he described the moment that changed everything. In the chaos of the final evacuation, Ethan had stayed behind with 2 injured soldiers while the rest were forced onto the helicopter. He believed help would return. It never did. By the time another unit reached the location, only Ethan was still alive. The official report listed the others as missing in action. Their deaths were never acknowledged, and their families were never given full answers.
Ethan was ordered not to speak about what had happened. The mission, he was told, had been classified and later canceled entirely. Admitting failure would have raised questions the military was unwilling to answer. Ethan complied, believing silence was part of his duty. What he did not realize was that his silence would slowly erase him as well. Laura confirmed his story days later when she finally gained limited access to a classified review summary from decades earlier. The mission Ethan described had been quietly investigated and then closed without public acknowledgement. Responsibility had been shifted, records altered, and surviving personnel discouraged from coming forward. Ethan Caldwell had been labeled unstable after his return, his testimony dismissed as psychological trauma rather than evidence. Once that label existed, everything else became easier to ignore. In that moment, Laura understood why no one had come for him. Ethan was not just forgotten, he was inconvenient. Remembering him meant reopening a chapter the system had chosen to seal. His suffering was not the result of weakness, but obedience. He had followed orders, even when those orders demanded silence. Back in his room, Ethan's strength faded quickly after each memory surfaced. Speaking cost him energy he no longer had. Still, when Laura held his hand and told him she believed him, something shifted. His expression softened. For the first time, the tension in his face eased. He whispered that he had been waiting a long time for someone to say that. But the truth carried consequences. As Laura pushed for recognition, administrators warned her to be careful. They told her she was reading too much into old records, that reopening classified matters could create unnecessary problems. Subtle pressure followed. Her access to files was restricted. Conversations stopped when she entered the room. It became clear that even now, decades later, the story Ethan carried was still considered dangerous. Ethan's condition deteriorated rapidly. His body weakened, but his mind grew sharper in brief, painful moments of clarity. One night, he looked directly at Laura and asked her if anyone would remember the men who never came home. She promised him they would, even though she did not yet know how. What Laura had uncovered could no longer be undone. The truth was real, documented, and undeniable. The only question left was whether it would be acknowledged in time. Because Ethan Caldwell did not have much time left, and the recognition he deserved had been delayed for nearly half a century. If you think the story ends with discovery, you're wrong. What happens next will prove whether honor can still be restored when it comes too late. Stay with this story.
Ethan Caldwell's health declined faster than anyone expected. His body, already weakened by age and years of neglect, began to fail, as if it had been holding itself together through sheer will alone. The moments of clarity he experienced became shorter, but they were also more peaceful. The anger that once lived in his eyes had faded, replaced by something closer to acceptance. Laura remained by his side whenever she could, knowing that time was no longer an abstract concept, but a countdown. Behind the scenes, however, something had begun to move. Laura had refused to let the truth disappear again. She documented everything Ethan had said, matched it with what little evidence still existed, and escalated the case beyond the hospital administration. When the story reached a small group within the Veterans Affairs system, the response was immediate. The files Laura had uncovered were not unfamiliar to them. They were part of a long list of unresolved cases, quietly acknowledged but rarely addressed. This time, the circumstances were different. Ethan was still alive. An internal review was accelerated. Old testimonies were revisited. Cross-references confirmed what Ethan had remembered with such painful clarity. The mission had failed, lives had been lost, and responsibility had been buried under layers of bureaucracy. There was no longer a way to deny it without denying the evidence itself. The conclusion was unavoidable. Ethan Caldwell had not only served with honor,
but had carried the consequences of others' decisions alone for decades. The decision was made quickly, almost urgently. There would be no public announcement, no media coverage, no attempt to correct the past on a large scale, but there would be recognition, the kind that should have come long ago. On a quiet morning, officials arrived at the hospital. They were not in uniform, but their presence carried weight. Laura stood at the back of the room as they entered Ethan's room, now filled with a silence very different from before. This silence was heavy with meaning. Ethan was awake. When one of the officials addressed him by name and thanked him for his service, Ethan's eyes focused in a way Laura had never seen. Slowly, as if the moment would vanish, he lifted his head. The official explained that the mission had been officially reviewed, that the men who were lost would finally be acknowledged, and that Ethan's role would be formally recognized. A small case was opened. Inside was a medal that should have been placed in his hands nearly 50 years earlier. Ethan did not cry. He did not smile. He simply closed his eyes and exhaled, as if releasing a breath he had been holding his entire adult life. When he spoke, his voice was steady. He said that the medal was not for him. He said it belonged to the men who never made it back. He asked only one thing in return, that their names be remembered. That request was granted. 2 days later, Ethan Caldwell passed away peacefully in his sleep. There were no crowds, no headlines, no national tribute. But his room was no longer empty. Laura was there. 2 hospital staff members stood quietly nearby, and on the bedside table, beside the dog tag he had never let go of, rested the medal that finally told the truth. In the weeks that followed, the families of the fallen soldiers were contacted. For the first time, they received answers that had been denied to them for decades. Letters were written, names were spoken. A story that had been buried was finally allowed to exist. Ethan Caldwell did not live to see the full impact of that truth, but because of him, others did. Some wars do not end when the fighting stops. They end when the truth is acknowledged, when sacrifice is named, when silence is broken. If this story moved you, remember this: there are still veterans living among us whose stories have never been heard. Honor does not always arrive on time, but remembering them is something we can still choose to do. If you believe these stories matter, take a moment to honor them. Subscribe to this channel, share this video, and leave a comment, not for the algorithm, but so these stories are not lost again. Because forgetting them is the last injustice.